Picture this. You're standing in the middle of Times Square, surrounded by thousands of people from every corner of the planet. Each person carries with them a different story about how the universe began, who created it, and what happens when we die. The Muslim believes in Allah and the Prophet Muhammad. The Christian worships Jesus as the Son of God. The Hindu sees multiple deities guiding their karma. The Buddhist seeks enlightenment without any gods at all. The Jew follows the Torah and waits for the Messiah. Each one is absolutely convinced they have the truth. Each one was taught from childhood that their version is the only correct one. But here's what's fascinating. If you could rewind history and drop each of these people into a completely different culture at birth, they'd believe something entirely different. The Muslim would likely be Christian. The Christian would likely be Hindu. The Hindu would likely be Buddhist. Their deepest convictions, the beliefs they die for, would be completely reversed based on nothing more than geography and timing. First of all, thank you for choosing to spend these moments with me and religion as it is. I know that, like me, you are interested in discovering and discussing those topics that seem to be hidden within our religions. Respecting all, we can talk about each one. If the topic interests you, please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like and turn on notifications to be alerted of all new videos posted. Thank you so much and enjoy. That should tell us something profound about the nature of religious belief. It's not discovered. It's inherited. It's not revealed from above. It's absorbed from around us. And today, we're going to explore how this entire system came to be. Not because some cosmic force decided humanity needed guidance, but because humans themselves needed answers, control and meaning in a world that offered none of those things easily. This isn't about attacking anyone's faith or mocking what people hold sacred. This is about understanding how one of humanity's most powerful creations actually got created. Because when you look at religion not as divine truth, but as human invention, everything starts to make sense. The contradictions, the similarities, the evolution, the politics, the wars, the comfort, the control, all of it fits together like pieces of a puzzle that's been scattered across thousands of years of human history. Let's start with something most people never think about. Why are there so many different religions in the first place? If there's one universal truth about the divine, wouldn't everyone have discovered the same thing? But that's not what we see. We see thousands upon thousands of different belief systems, each claiming to be the real one, each with different gods, different rules, different afterlives, different creation stories. Some say the earth is thousands of years old, others say billions. Some say there's one God, others say many, others say none. Some say reincarnation, others say heaven and hell, others say nothing after death. This isn't what truth looks like. When scientists around the world study gravity, they all come to the same conclusions. When mathematicians work on equations, they get the same answers regardless of their culture. Truth is universal. It doesn't change based on where you're born or when you live. But religion does. And that's our first clue that we're looking at human creation, not divine revelation. Now imagine you're one of our earliest ancestors. You're living maybe 50,000 years ago, long before cities, before agriculture, before writing. Your world is small but dangerous. Lightning splits the sky without warning. Earthquakes shake the ground beneath your feet. Disease sweeps through your group, killing people you love. Animals attack. Food runs out. People die young. And you have no idea why any of this happens. You don't know about bacteria causing illness. You don't know about tectonic plates causing earthquakes. You don't know about electrical charges creating lightning. You don't know about weather patterns or animal behavior or nutrition. You know almost nothing about how the world actually works, but you're human, which means you're a pattern-seeking, storytelling creature. You can't just accept that things happen randomly. Your brain demands explanations. So what do? You create them. That lightning wasn't just electrical discharge, it was anger from the sky. That earthquake wasn't just shifting plates, it was the earth spirit stirring. That disease wasn't just bacteria, it was punishment for breaking some invisible rule. This is where religion begins, not with revelation but with imagination, filling the gaps that knowledge couldn't. And once you've imagined these invisible forces, the next step is figuring out how to deal with them. If the sky spirit is angry, maybe you need to offer it something. If the earth spirit is restless, maybe you need to perform a ritual. If you've offended the disease spirit, maybe you need to confess your wrongdoing. This isn't stupidity. This is humans doing what humans do best, finding patterns, creating explanations, and trying to gain some control over an uncontrollable world. But here's where it gets interesting. These early explanations weren't just individual thoughts, they became group beliefs. And once they became group beliefs, they became powerful tools for organizing society. Think about it. If everyone in your tribe believes the same invisible forces control life and death, and if you're the person who claims to understand these forces best, suddenly you have enormous influence. You don't need to be the strongest or the fastest. You just need to be the most convincing when it comes to explaining the unexplainable. This is how the first religious leaders emerged. Not because they had special access to divine truth, but because they were skilled at creating compelling stories about invisible forces. And once they had that role, they had every reason to protect it and expand it. The more complex the stories became, the more specialized knowledge was required to understand them. The more specialized the knowledge, the more powerful the storytellers became. Look at any early civilization, and you'll see this pattern. In ancient Egypt, the priests controlled not just religious knowledge, but also mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. They were the educated class because they had made themselves indispensable by claiming to understand the gods. In ancient Mesopotamia, the priests controlled the temples, which were also the economic centers of the cities. They didn't just handle religious duties, they managed trade, agriculture, and law. Religion wasn't separate from power, it was the foundation of power. And as these early religious systems developed, they began to serve multiple functions beyond just explaining natural phenomena. They created social order by establishing rules about how people should behave. They provided comfort by promising that death wasn't the end. They created identity by defining who belonged to the group and who didn't. They justified leadership by claiming rulers were chosen by the gods. They encouraged cooperation by teaching that helping others pleased the invisible forces. But most importantly, they created a system where questioning the system itself became dangerous. If you doubted the gods, you weren't just wrong, you were threatening the very foundation of society. You were risking everyone's safety by potentially angering the forces that kept the community alive. This is how early religions protected themselves from criticism. They made doubt not just intellectually wrong, but morally dangerous. As human societies grew more complex, so did their religious systems. Gods developed personalities, families, and detailed mythologies. Rituals became more elaborate. Sacred texts were created to preserve the stories. Temples were built to house the worship. Festivals marked important religious occasions. Laws were written based on religious principles. Education was controlled by religious authorities. What started as simple explanations for natural events became comprehensive worldviews that governed every aspect of human life. And because these systems developed over centuries or millennia, they felt ancient, permanent, and unquestionable to the people living within them. But they weren't ancient in any cosmic sense. They were just old enough that no living person remembered a time before them. Here's something fascinating. When different human groups developed separately, they created completely different religious systems. If religion came from a single divine source, wouldn't it be the same everywhere? But it's not. The gods of ancient Greece looked nothing like the gods of ancient China. The creation stories of Native Americans share no details with the creation stories of Aboriginal Australians. The afterlife beliefs of ancient Egyptians have nothing in common with the afterlife beliefs of ancient Mayans. This diversity isn't evidence of different gods revealing themselves to different peoples. It's evidence of different peoples creating different explanations for the same universal human experiences. Death, suffering, natural disasters, the changing seasons, the mystery of consciousness. Every culture faced these puzzles, but every culture solved them differently, because every culture was working with different environments, different challenges, and different existing knowledge. Even the moral codes that religions created reflect the specific needs of the societies that created them. Desert nomads developed rules about water rights and hospitality to strangers. Agricultural societies developed rules about property and seasonal festivals. Trading cultures developed rules about honesty and contracts. Mountain peoples developed different survival strategies than coastal peoples, and their religious rules reflected those differences. This isn't divine law adapting to human needs. This is human law being attributed to divine sources to give it more authority and permanence. When a rule comes from the chief, people might argue with it. When a rule comes from the gods, people obey it without question. Religion became the ultimate enforcement mechanism for social cooperation. But there's something else religion provided that might be even more important than social order. It provided emotional comfort in the face of life's hardships. When someone you love dies, religion offers the hope that you'll see them again. When you're suffering, religion suggests there's a purpose to your pain. When life feels meaningless, religion provides a cosmic framework where everything matters. When you feel alone, religion tells you invisible forces are watching over you. These aren't small things, they're among the deepest human needs. And religion met those needs not by solving the problems that created them, but by reframing them in ways that made them bearable. You can't bring back the dead, but you can believe they're waiting for you somewhere else. You can't eliminate suffering, but you can believe it's building your character or testing your faith. You can't prove your life has cosmic significance, but you can believe a God has a plan for you. This emotional function of religion helps explain why it's been so persistent throughout human history. Even when scientific explanations replaced religious ones for natural phenomena, religion continued to provide comfort about the existential questions that science couldn't answer. What's the purpose of life? What happens when we die? Why do we suffer? How should we treat each other? Science can tell us how things work, but it can't tell us why they matter. Religion steps into that gap and provides meaning, purpose, and hope. Not because these things are objectively true, but because humans need them to be true in order to function in a world that can often seem random, cruel, and meaningless. The genius of religion as a human invention is that it solved multiple problems at once. It explained the unexplainable organized society, comforted the suffering, and gave people a sense of cosmic importance. No wonder it spread so successfully across every human culture. No wonder people were willing to live and die for their religious beliefs. These systems didn't just describe reality, they made reality livable. But as powerful as these early religious systems were, they had to evolve to survive. And this is where we see one of the most telling aspects of religion as human invention. Real truth doesn't need to adapt. Gravity works the same way today as it did 1,000 years ago. Mathematics produces the same results regardless of political changes. But religion changes constantly. Look at Christianity. In its earliest days, it was a small Jewish sect focused on humility, poverty, and the imminent end of the world. Early Christians sold their possessions and shared everything in common. They expected Jesus to return within their lifetimes. They had no churches, no pope, no elaborate theology. Fast forward a few centuries, and Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire, complete with massive cathedrals, wealthy bishops, and complex doctrines that would have been completely foreign to those first followers. This wasn't divine evolution, this was human adaptation. As Christianity spread beyond its Jewish roots, it absorbed Greek philosophy to appeal to educated Romans. It incorporated pagan festivals to make conversion easier for non-Jews. It developed hierarchical structures that mirrored Roman government to gain political legitimacy. It created elaborate rituals that satisfied people's need for ceremony and spectacle. The same pattern appears everywhere. Islam began as the revelation of a single man in the Arabian desert. Within a century, it had fractured into different sects with different interpretations, different leaders, and different political alliances. Buddhism started as one man's teaching about ending suffering through detachment. Over time, it split into numerous schools, some focusing on meditation, others on devotion, others on elaborate philosophies that Buddha himself never taught. This constant adaptation reveals something crucial about religion. It's not a fixed truth being preserved across time. It's a living system that changes based on human needs, political pressures, and cultural shifts. And the people within these systems, rather than seeing this as evidence that their religion is human-made, instead create elaborate explanations for why their particular version is the authentic one, while all the others are corruptions or misunderstandings. Think about how convenient that is. Every religious group claims to have the pure original truth while dismissing competing versions as human distortions. But from the outside, looking at the historical record, what we see is continuous human modification from the very beginning. There was never a pure, unchanging original. There were always people making decisions about what to include, what to emphasize, what to modify based on their circumstances and goals. This becomes even more obvious when you look at how religions spread geographically. They don't spread randomly or based on their truth value. They spread along trade routes through military conquest and via cultural exchange. Christianity spread through the Roman Empire because Rome had roads, armies, and political unity. Islam spread through the Middle East and North Africa because Muslim armies conquered those territories. Buddhism spread along the Silk Road because merchants carried ideas along with goods. If religion were simply truth revealing itself, you'd expect it to appear independently in multiple places. But that's not what happens. Instead, you can trace the specific historical paths by which each religion moved from one culture to another, and you can see how it changed along the way to fit new circumstances. When Spanish conquistadors brought Christianity to the Americas, the version that took root wasn't pure European Christianity. It blended with indigenous beliefs, creating unique hybrid forms like Mexican Catholicism, with its emphasis on the Virgin of Guadalupe. When Buddhism moved from India to Tibet, it absorbed local Bon traditions and became Tibetan Buddhism, with practices that would be unrecognizable to early Indian Buddhists. This isn't contamination of pure truth. This is how human ideas actually spread and survive. They adapt, they blend, they change based on what works in new environments. And the fact that religions follow this pattern so perfectly is strong evidence that they're human creations subject to the same evolutionary pressures as any other cultural system. Another fascinating aspect of religion as human invention is how it reflects the technology and knowledge available when it was created. Ancient religious texts describe the world in terms that made sense to ancient people. The sky is a solid dome with windows for rain. The earth sits on pillars or floats on water. The stars are small lights attached to the sky dome. Disease is caused by evil spirits. Mental illness is demonic possession. These aren't poetic metaphors. These were the actual beliefs of the people who wrote these texts. They described their world as they understood it. And when later believers discovered that these descriptions were scientifically incorrect, they had to perform elaborate intellectual gymnastics to preserve their faith. They reinterpreted literal descriptions as symbolic. They claimed that God was speaking to ancient people in terms they could understand. They argued that scientific accuracy wasn't the point of religious texts. But notice what's happening here. Instead of the evidence changing the belief is being modified to accommodate the evidence. That's backwards from how we approach truth in every other area of life. When we discover new facts about medicine, we change our medical practices. When we learn new things about engineering, we build bridges differently. But when we discover new facts that contradict religious claims, we change our interpretation of the religious claims while insisting the underlying truth remains unchanged. This reveals something important about how religion functions in human psychology. It's not primarily about factual accuracy, it's about meaning, identity, and emotional comfort. And because these psychological needs are so powerful, people will go to extraordinary lengths to preserve their religious beliefs, even when the factual foundations crumble. Consider how religious institutions have responded to scientific discoveries over the past few centuries. When Copernicus and Galileo showed that the Earth revolves around the Sun, rather than the other way around, religious authorities initially rejected this as heretical. They had biblical passages that seemed to describe a stationary Earth and a moving Sun. But eventually, as the evidence became overwhelming, They quietly reinterpreted those passages as poetic rather than literal. When Darwin proposed evolution, religious leaders initially rejected it as contradicting the creation story. But over time, many religious institutions found ways to accept evolution while maintaining their belief in divine creation. They argued that God used evolution as his method, or that the creation story was allegorical, or that evolution explained the body while God created the soul. When archaeologists and historians began studying the origins of religious texts and found evidence of human authorship, editing, and borrowing from earlier sources, religious scholars developed sophisticated theories about divine inspiration, working through human authors, or multiple levels of meaning, or the gradual revelation of truth over time. In each case, the pattern is the same. Religious institutions resist new knowledge that threatens their claims, then gradually accommodate it while maintaining that their core beliefs remain untouched. This flexibility has allowed religions to survive scientific advances that might otherwise have destroyed them. But it's also evidence that these systems are human constructions designed to meet human needs rather than repositories of unchanging cosmic truth. If religions were actually communications from divine beings, you'd expect them to contain knowledge that humans couldn't have discovered on their own. You'd expect scientific insights that wouldn't be discovered for centuries. You'd expect historical information that could be verified later. You'd expect moral teachings that transcended the limitations of their time and culture. But that's not what we find. Religious texts contain the scientific understanding, historical knowledge, and moral frameworks that were available to the people who wrote them. Nothing more, nothing less. They don't anticipate later discoveries. They don't transcend the prejudices of their era. They don't contain information that their human authors couldn't have known. This isn't a failure of divine communication. It's evidence that these texts had human authors working with human knowledge and human concerns. They were trying to make sense of their world using the tools available to them, and they created remarkable works of literature, philosophy, and moral guidance that have inspired billions of people across thousands of years. But inspiration isn't the same thing as literal truth. Beauty isn't the same thing as factual accuracy, and the power of these human creations to move people, comfort them, and guide them doesn't require them to be anything other than what they actually are. Extraordinary achievements of human imagination, wisdom, and spiritual insight. The question isn't whether these achievements are valuable. They clearly are. The question is whether we need to believe they came from supernatural sources in order to appreciate their value. And increasingly, as we understand more about human psychology, anthropology, and history, the answer appears to be no. We can appreciate religious art without believing angels guided the artist's hands. We can find wisdom in religious texts without believing God's dictated them. We can participate in religious communities without accepting supernatural explanations for how those communities formed. We can even experience transcendent emotions and spiritual insights without attributing them to divine intervention. What we're left with then is something both more remarkable and more human than the traditional religious narrative suggests. We're left with the story of how our species, faced with an overwhelming and often terrifying universe, managed to create systems of meaning that could sustain entire civilizations. We're left with evidence of human creativity, ingenuity, and resilience that's actually more impressive than any miracle story. Think about what early humans accomplished. They took their fear of the unknown and transformed it into elaborate mythologies. They took their need for social cooperation and built it into cosmic moral systems. They took their terror of death and crafted it into promises of eternal life. They took their desire for justice and projected it onto invisible judges who would balance all scales eventually. This wasn't divine intervention. This was human genius at work. And once these systems were established, they began to function almost like living organisms. They competed with each other for followers. They adapted to new environments. They merged with other systems when beneficial. They split apart when internal tensions became too great. They evolved defense mechanisms to protect themselves from criticism. They developed methods for spreading to new populations. The most successful religious systems were those that best met human psychological needs while also serving the practical requirements of social organization. They had to be emotionally satisfying enough to comfort people in times of crisis. They had to be intellectually coherent enough to answer basic questions about existence. They had to be socially useful enough to help groups cooperate and survive. And they had to be flexible enough to adapt when circumstances changed. But there's something else that successful religions needed, something that's often overlooked in discussions about their origins. They needed to be memorable. Before writing was common, religious ideas had to be transmitted orally from generation to generation. This meant they had to stick in people's minds. They had to be the kind of stories that people would want to tell and retell. This requirement shaped religious narratives in fascinating ways. The most enduring religious stories aren't necessarily the most realistic or even the most morally sophisticated. They're the most memorable. They feature dramatic conflicts between good and evil. They include miraculous events that capture the imagination. They have clear heroes and villains. They promise extreme consequences for moral choices. They use vivid imagery and emotional language. These aren't the characteristics you'd expect from divine communications trying to convey complex truths about the universe, but they're exactly the characteristics you'd expect from human stories designed to be passed down through oral tradition. They're the features that make stories stick in memory and get repeated accurately across generations. Look at the structure of religious narratives across different cultures. They consistently follow patterns that storytellers have known for thousands of years. There's usually a perfect beginning that gets disrupted by some form of evil or chaos. There's a struggle between opposing forces. There's often a hero figure who makes sacrifices to restore order. There's usually a promise that justice will eventually triumph and harmony will be restored. This isn't cosmic truth revealing itself. This is the basic template for compelling human storytelling. It appears in religious myths, but it also appears in fairy tales, epic poems, novels, and movies. It's how humans naturally structure narratives to make them emotionally satisfying and memorable. The fact that religious stories follow these same patterns suggests they emerged from the same human storytelling traditions as every other narrative form. Even the specific details of religious stories often reflect the storytelling conventions of their time and place. Ancient Middle Eastern religions feature shepherds, deserts, and tribal conflicts because those were familiar elements to their original audiences. Ancient Greek religions feature complex family dramas among the gods because Greek culture valued sophisticated psychological narratives. Ancient Egyptian religions emphasized death and rebirth because the annual flooding of the Nile made these cycles central to Egyptian life. None of this diminishes the power or beauty of these stories. Human storytelling is one of our species' greatest achievements. The ability to create narratives that can inspire, comfort, and guide people across centuries is remarkable. But recognizing these stories as human creations helps us understand why they work the way they do and why they've been so influential. It also helps explain some of their limitations. Stories created by humans in specific historical contexts inevitably reflect the knowledge, values, and concerns of those contexts. Ancient religious narratives often include elements that modern people find troubling. They may endorse slavery, subjugate women, promote violence against outsiders, or support political systems we now consider unjust. When we view these stories as divine communications, we face a difficult choice. Either we have to defend these problematic elements as somehow representing eternal divine wisdom, or we have to engage in complex interpretive gymnastics to explain why they don't mean what they appear to mean. But when we understand these stories as human products of their time, the problematic elements make perfect sense. They reflect the limitations and biases of their human authors. This understanding actually makes it easier to appreciate what's valuable in religious traditions while setting aside what's harmful or outdated. We can admire the compassion in Buddhist teachings without accepting the social hierarchies they sometimes endorsed. We can appreciate the emphasis on justice in Jewish law without embracing every specific legal prescription. We can value the focus on love in Christian ethics without accepting every moral judgment made by early Christian leaders. But perhaps the most important insight that comes from understanding religion as human invention is recognizing how it continues to evolve today. Religious systems haven't stopped changing just because we now have written texts and established institutions. They're still adapting to new circumstances, still responding to new knowledge, still meeting changing human needs. Modern religious movements often look quite different from their historical predecessors. They emphasize different values, use different language, and focus on different problems. Progressive Christianity today sounds very different from medieval Christianity. Contemporary Buddhism in the West has absorbed psychological concepts that wouldn't have been available to ancient Buddhist teachers. Modern Islam includes reform movements that would have been inconceivable to early Muslim scholars. This ongoing evolution isn't corruption of pure religious truth. It's evidence that these systems are still doing what they've always done. They're adapting to meet human needs in changing circumstances. They're incorporating new knowledge and responding to new challenges. They're continuing to serve their fundamental function as meaning-making systems created by humans for humans. Understanding this process can actually make us more thoughtful consumers and creators of religious ideas. Instead of accepting religious claims simply because they're traditional or authoritative, we can evaluate them based on whether they actually serve human flourishing. Instead of treating religious texts as infallible guides to cosmic truth, we can approach them as valuable but fallible human wisdom that needs to be interpreted thoughtfully for contemporary circumstances. This perspective also helps explain why religious conflicts are so persistent and bitter. When people believe their religious system contains literal divine truth, disagreement becomes more than intellectual difference. It becomes a fundamental threat to the cosmic order. But when we understand religious systems as human attempts to create meaning and organize society, disagreement becomes more manageable. We can recognize that different groups have created different solutions to universal human problems, and we can evaluate these solutions based on their practical consequences rather than their claimed divine authority. None of this means that religious experience isn't real or valuable. People have profound spiritual experiences within religious contexts. They find deep meaning, powerful community, and transformative insight through religious practice. They discover resources for compassion, forgiveness, and personal growth that genuinely change their lives for the better. But these experiences don't require supernatural explanation. The human capacity for transcendence, awe, and spiritual insight is remarkable enough without attributing it to divine intervention. The ability of human communities to support each other through crisis and celebration is beautiful without needing cosmic endorsement. The power of human wisdom traditions to guide moral development and personal growth is impressive whether or not they originated in heaven. In fact, recognizing these achievements as fundamentally human might make them even more remarkable. It means that beings like us, working with the same cognitive and emotional capacities we all possess, managed to create systems that could sustain meaning across millennia. It means that ordinary people, using ordinary human faculties, developed insights about ethics, purpose, and transcendence that continue to inspire and guide billions of people. This human origin story for religion is actually more hopeful than the divine origin story in many ways. If religions were created by divine beings with perfect knowledge and unlimited power, then their limitations and failures would be puzzling and discouraging. Why would perfect beings create systems that led to so much conflict? Why would all-knowing entities produce teachings that needed constant reinterpretation as human knowledge expanded? But if religions were created by humans doing their best with limited knowledge and finite wisdom, then their limitations make perfect sense, while their achievements become even more impressive. Ancient people with no understanding of modern science or psychology still managed to create ethical frameworks sophisticated enough to guide complex civilizations. They developed practices for cultivating compassion, wisdom, and inner peace that remain effective today. They built communities capable of preserving and transmitting valuable insights across countless generations. The story of religion as human invention is ultimately a story about human potential. It's about our species' remarkable capacity to create meaning in the face of uncertainty, to build cooperation despite our individual limitations, and to develop wisdom that transcends the circumstances of its creation. It's about the power of human imagination, creativity, and moral insight to construct systems that can transform individual lives and entire societies. Understanding this story doesn't require abandoning everything valuable about religious traditions. It requires recognizing them as extraordinary human achievements rather than supernatural interventions. It means approaching them with both appreciation for their insights and critical evaluation of their limitations. It means taking responsibility for continuing their evolution in directions that serve human flourishing, rather than simply preserving them exactly as they were created by people with different knowledge and different challenges. This perspective opens up possibilities for spiritual and ethical development that aren't constrained by the specific historical circumstances in which traditional religions emerged. We can learn from the wisdom they've preserved while adapting their insights to contemporary knowledge and values. we can maintain their emphasis on meaning, community, and transcendence while developing new approaches to these universal human needs. The recognition that religion was invented by humans doesn't diminish its significance. If anything, it reveals just how remarkable our species can be when we put our minds to the fundamental questions of existence. We created these systems because we needed them, and they worked well enough to survive and spread across the entire planet. That's not a small accomplishment. But now we have new knowledge, new challenges, and new opportunities. We can honour what previous generations created while taking responsibility for what we create next. We can appreciate the human genius that produced these meaning-making systems while using our own human genius to develop approaches that work better for our contemporary circumstances. The story of religion as human invention is really the story of human beings at their most creative, most ambitious, and most hopeful. It's about people who refuse to accept a meaningless existence and instead built elaborate systems to create purpose and direction. It's about communities that develop practices for mutual support and moral development that could be sustained across centuries. It's about individuals who had insights about compassion, justice, and transcendence that continue to inspire people today. This story deserves our respect, our gratitude, and our continued participation. Not because it came from supernatural sources, but because it came from sources very much like ourselves. People who face the same fundamental questions we face, who struggled with the same basic challenges we struggle with, and who managed to create something beautiful and valuable despite their limitations. The real test of whether religion is human invention comes when we look at how it responds to crisis. Throughout history, whenever societies have faced major upheavals, religions have done something fascinating. They've changed, sometimes dramatically, sometimes in ways that would shock their earlier followers. But they've always adapted to survive. During the Black Death in medieval Europe, Christianity developed entirely new theological frameworks to explain why a loving God would allow such massive suffering. These weren't refinements of existing doctrine. These were fundamentally new ideas created by humans trying to make sense of unprecedented tragedy. When the printing press made literacy widespread, Protestant reformers didn't just translate existing texts. They reinterpreted centuries of established teaching to fit a world where ordinary people could read scripture for themselves. When the scientific revolution challenged religious explanations of natural phenomena, religious thinkers didn't simply defend old positions. They developed new theological concepts like deism, which preserved belief in God while accepting scientific explanations for how the universe operates. When democracy replaced monarchy as the dominant political system, religions found ways to support democratic values despite having spent centuries endorsing divine right of kings. This pattern continues today. Modern religious movements routinely incorporate psychological insights that weren't available to ancient religious teachers. They adopt environmental concerns that would have been meaningless to people who lived in sparsely populated agricultural societies. They develop positions on bioethics, artificial intelligence, and global economics that address challenges their founders never imagined. None of this adaptation represents corruption of pure religious truth. It represents religions doing exactly what human institutions do when circumstances change. They evolve, they incorporate new information, they respond to new needs. They find ways to remain relevant to people living in different conditions than their original audiences. But there's something even more revealing about how religions change over time. They don't just adapt to external circumstances, they adapt to internal contradictions. When religious teachings conflict with each other or with observable reality, religious communities develop interpretive strategies to resolve these tensions. They create hierarchies of importance that allow some teachings to override others. They develop allegorical readings that transform literal claims into symbolic ones. They argue that earlier revelation was incomplete and later revelation provides fuller understanding. These interpretive strategies are sophisticated and often ingenious. Religious scholars have developed elaborate methodologies for harmonizing contradictory texts, explaining away failed predictions, and reconciling ancient moral teachings with contemporary ethical insights. But the very need for such strategies reveals something important. If these texts were actually communications from perfect divine beings, they wouldn't require such extensive human interpretation to make sense. The fact that every religious tradition has developed complex hermeneutical systems for interpreting its foundational texts suggests that those texts were created by fallible humans working with limited information. Perfect beings wouldn't produce communications that needed constant reinterpretation, but humans trying to understand cosmic questions with finite knowledge and cultural conditioning would naturally create texts that future generations would need to interpret creatively to maintain their relevance. Consider how different religious communities reading the same text often reach completely opposite conclusions about major issues. Christian denominations that share the same Bible disagree fundamentally about salvation, church governance, social ethics, and end times prophecy. Islamic scholars working with the same Quran and Hadith reach different conclusions about law, politics, gender roles, and religious practice. Jewish rabbis studying identical Torah passages develop competing interpretations about ritual requirements, dietary laws, and community obligations. If these texts contained clear divine guidance, such widespread disagreement would be puzzling. But if they're human documents created in specific historical contexts and later read by people in different contexts with different concerns, such interpretive diversity makes perfect sense. Human texts require human interpretation, and humans naturally bring their own experiences, values, and needs to the interpretive process. This interpretive flexibility has actually been crucial to religious survival. Texts that could only be understood in one way would quickly become obsolete as circumstances changed. But texts that can be interpreted in multiple ways can remain relevant across very different historical periods. The price of this flexibility is that the texts themselves don't provide the clear, unchanging guidance that religious authorities often claim they provide. Instead, what we see is human communities using ancient texts as raw material for creating contemporary meaning. The texts provide a shared reference point and a sense of connection to tradition, but the actual guidance people derive from them reflects their own moral intuitions, practical needs, and cultural values more than any fixed meaning embedded in the texts themselves. This process becomes even more obvious when we examine how religions spread across cultural boundaries. When Buddhism moved from India to China, it didn't simply translate Indian concepts into Chinese language, it absorbed Confucian and Taoist ideas, creating forms of Buddhism that emphasized different values and practices than their Indian predecessors. When Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, it incorporated Greek philosophical concepts and Roman organizational structures that transformed it into something quite different from its Jewish origins. When Islam expanded beyond Arabia, it adapted to Persian administrative systems, absorbed elements of local mystical traditions, and developed legal frameworks that reflected the needs of settled agricultural societies rather than nomadic tribal communities. When these religions later spread to Africa, Asia, and the Americas, they underwent further transformations as they encountered different cultural contexts and practical challenges. This pattern of cultural adaptation isn't unique to religion. It's how all human ideas spread and survive. Languages change as they move across geographic boundaries. Art forms evolve as they encounter different aesthetic traditions. Political systems adapt as they're implemented in different societies. The fact that religions follow these same patterns of cultural evolution strongly suggests they're human cultural products rather than unchanging divine revelations. But perhaps the most telling evidence for religion as human invention comes from examining how religious ideas emerge and develop within individual minds. When people describe their religious experiences, they consistently report that new insights feel like discoveries rather than external communications. They describe gradual understanding, sudden realizations, and slowly developing convictions. They talk about wrestling with difficult questions, comparing different perspectives, and eventually reaching conclusions that feel personally authentic. This is exactly how human creativity and problem-solving work in every other domain. Scientists describe similar processes when making discoveries. Artists report comparable experiences when developing new forms of expression. Philosophers undergo analogous struggles when working through complex arguments. The phenomenology of religious insight matches the phenomenology of human intellectual and creative achievement generally. Even the most dramatic religious experiences, the ones that feel most clearly supernatural to those who have them, follow patterns that neuroscientists and psychologists can explain in terms of normal brain function under unusual circumstances. Mystical experiences involve predictable changes in brain activity that can be triggered by meditation, fasting, sensory deprivation, rhythmic movement, or psychoactive substances. Prophetic visions often occur during periods of intense stress, sleep deprivation, or psychological crisis. Divine inspiration frequently emerges from long periods of focused study and contemplation. None of this diminishes the significance of these experiences for the people who have them. They can be genuinely transformative, profoundly meaningful, and deeply valuable. But their neurological and psychological mechanisms are thoroughly human. They represent the remarkable capacity of human consciousness to generate experiences of transcendence, insight, and connection under certain conditions. They don't require supernatural explanation any more than other extraordinary human experiences like artistic inspiration, scientific breakthrough, or falling in love. The human origin of religious experience also helps explain why religious practices developed along such similar lines across different cultures. Humans everywhere have discovered that certain activities tend to produce transcendent experiences. Repetitive chanting or singing, rhythmic movement, focused meditation, communal ritual, fasting, and pilgrimage all reliably generate altered states of consciousness that feel spiritually significant. These practices weren't revealed by gods. They were discovered by humans experimenting with different ways of expanding their awareness and connecting with something larger than themselves. The fact that similar practices emerged independently in cultures with no contact with each other suggests they tap into universal features of human psychology and neurology rather than supernatural realities. The social dimensions of religion also reflect thoroughly human needs and patterns. Humans are inherently social creatures who require community, shared identity, and mutual support to thrive. Religious communities provide all of these things, often more effectively than secular alternatives. They create strong bonds between people who might otherwise have little in common. They establish regular opportunities for social interaction and mutual aid. They provide frameworks for celebrating important life transitions and coping with loss and crisis. But religious communities also exhibit the same dynamics as other human groups. They develop hierarchies, compete for resources, exclude outsiders, and sometimes exploit their members. They're subject to the same social psychology that affects families, businesses, political organizations, and clubs. When religious communities behave badly, it's not because they've been corrupted by external forces. It's because they're human institutions operating according to human social dynamics. The moral teachings that emerge from religious traditions also reflect recognizably human moral intuitions. The Golden Rule appears in some form across virtually every religious tradition, but it also emerges naturally from human empathy and the practical requirements of social cooperation. Prohibitions against murder, theft, and dishonesty are universal, not because they were revealed by gods, but because they're necessary for any human community to function. Where religious moral teachings go beyond these universal principles, they typically reflect the specific needs and values of the communities that created them. Dietary restrictions, clothing requirements, ritual obligations, and sexual regulations vary dramatically across different religions because they address different cultural contexts and social challenges. These variations don't represent different divine preferences. They represent different human solutions to the problem of maintaining group identity and social order. Even the concept of divine beings themselves reflects human psychological patterns. The gods that humans have created consistently exhibit amplified versions of human characteristics. They're more powerful than humans, but they use that power in ways that make sense to human minds. They're more knowledgeable than humans, but they're concerned about the same things that concern humans. They're more virtuous than humans, but they define virtue in terms that humans can understand and aspire to. When religions describe divine beings as completely transcendent and beyond human comprehension, they quickly run into practical problems. Such beings would be impossible to relate to, pray to, or learn from. So even the most abstract theological concepts eventually get translated into more anthropomorphic terms that humans can actually work with. The history of theology is largely the history of humans trying to maintain the idea of transcendent divinity while making it accessible to human understanding and relevant to human concerns. This anthropomorphic tendency becomes even more obvious when we look at how different cultures have imagined divine beings. They consistently reflect the values, concerns, and social structures of the people who created them. Warrior cultures create warrior gods. Agricultural societies create gods concerned with fertility and harvest. Hierarchical societies create divine monarchies. Egalitarian societies create more democratic spiritual realms. The evolution of divine concepts within individual religious traditions also follows human psychological patterns. Early stages often feature concrete, personal deities with specific personalities and preferences. Later stages tend toward more abstract, philosophical concepts of divinity that reflect more sophisticated theological thinking. This progression from concrete to abstract, from simple to complex, from personal to universal, matches how human thinking develops both individually and culturally. What we're seeing throughout all of these patterns is religion functioning exactly as we'd expect human meaning-making systems to function. They emerge from human needs, they develop according to human psychological and social dynamics, they adapt to changing human circumstances, and they reflect human values and concerns. At every level, from individual religious experience to large-scale institutional development, we see thoroughly human processes at work. This doesn't mean religion is somehow fake or worthless. Human creations can be extraordinarily valuable and meaningful. Art, music, literature, philosophy, science, and democracy are all human inventions, but that doesn't make them less real or important. In many ways, recognizing them as human achievements makes them more remarkable, not less. The same is true for religion. When we understand it as an extraordinary human accomplishment, we can appreciate both its genuine insights and its inevitable limitations. We can learn from its wisdom while correcting its errors. We can participate in its communities while working to make them more just and inclusive. We can experience its transcendent possibilities while maintaining critical thinking about its claims. Most importantly, understanding religion as human invention empowers us to take responsibility for its continued development. If these systems were created by divine beings, we'd have no choice but to accept them as they are. But if they were created by humans like ourselves, then we have both the opportunity and the obligation to improve them. We can preserve what serves human flourishing while discarding what causes harm. We can adapt ancient wisdom to contemporary knowledge while maintaining connection to valuable traditions. We can create new forms of spiritual community that meet current needs while learning from thousands of years of human experimentation with meaning and transcendence. The story of religion as human invention is ultimately a story about human potential. It reveals our species' remarkable capacity to create systems of meaning that can sustain individuals and communities across centuries of change. It demonstrates our ability to develop practices that cultivate wisdom, compassion, and inner peace. It shows our talent for building communities that can preserve and transmit valuable insights across countless generations, but it also reveals our responsibility. If we created these systems, then we're responsible for what they become. We can't blame divine will for religious violence, oppression, or exclusion. We can't claim that outdated teachings represent eternal truth that can't be questioned. We can't hide behind religious authority to avoid the hard work of moral reasoning and social progress. Understanding religion as human invention doesn't solve all the challenges these systems present, but it clarifies where those challenges come from and empowers us to address them constructively. Instead of defending every aspect of traditional religion as divinely ordained, we can evaluate religious ideas and practices based on their actual consequences for human well-being. Instead of treating religious texts as infallible guides to cosmic truth, we can approach them as valuable but fallible human wisdom that needs thoughtful interpretation for contemporary circumstances. Instead of accepting religious institutions as they are, we can work to reform them in directions that better serve their stated values of love, justice, and human flourishing. The recognition that religion was invented by humans doesn't diminish its significance. If anything, it reveals just how remarkable our species can be when we tackle the fundamental questions of existence. We created these systems because we needed them, and they've worked well enough to spread across the entire planet and survive for thousands of years. That's an extraordinary human achievement that deserves our respect, our gratitude, and our continued engagement. Not because it came from supernatural sources, but because it came from people very much like ourselves who face the same basic challenges we face and manage to create something beautiful, meaningful, and enduring despite their limitations. The story continues with us. We inherit both the wisdom and the problems that previous generations created. Our task is to build on their insights while addressing their blind spots, to preserve what serves human flourishing while transforming what causes harm, to honor their creativity while exercising our own. Understanding that religion was invented by humans doesn't end the story. It empowers us to write the next chapter more thoughtfully, more compassionately, and more wisely than ever before. So where does this leave us? Standing in that same crowded Times Square, surrounded by those same thousands of people with their thousands of different beliefs, but now we see the picture differently. We understand that these aren't competing messages from different gods. They're different human solutions to the same universal challenges: fear of death, need for meaning, desire for community, the search for purpose in an often chaotic world. This understanding doesn't make these systems less valuable. It makes them more human, more relatable, more workable. Because if humans created these meaning-making systems, then humans can improve them. We're not stuck with ancient answers to ancient questions. We can build on what works, discard what doesn't, and create new approaches that serve us better. The evidence is overwhelming. Religion bears all the hallmarks of human invention. It reflects our psychology, our history, our limitations, and our genius. It changes when we change. It adapts when circumstances demand it. It serves our needs rather than commanding them from some cosmic authority. But here's what's remarkable about that: the fact that humans, with nothing but their imagination, intelligence, and deep need for meaning, managed to create systems that could guide entire civilizations for thousands of years. That's not a small thing. That's extraordinary. That's worth respecting, even as we recognize it for what it actually is. The question now isn't whether religion came from heaven or earth. The question is what we do with this knowledge. How do we honor the human creativity that built these systems while taking responsibility for where they go next? How do we preserve the wisdom while discarding the harmful? How do we maintain the sense of transcendence while staying grounded in truth? Those are human questions that require human answers, and fortunately, we're pretty good at that kind of thing. After all, we invented religion in the first place.